The next speaker I've had the privilege to introduce, I was speaking with some guy yesterday in the youth participation group, and he told me that this guy is absolutely amazing. So Jeffrey Arnett is a research professor in the Department of Psychology at the Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. He's the editor of the Journal of Adolescence Research and the author of a book, Emerging Adulthood, The Winding Road from the Late Teens through to the 20s. And he's also the founder and executive director of the Society for Study and Emerging Adulthood. So, guys, I would love to introduce to you Professor Jeffrey Arnett.
Good morning, everyone. 30 is the new 20. How many of you have heard that phrase before? Wow, a lot of you. It's a very popular phrase in the United States these days. And what's it mean? It means that it takes longer to grow up today than it used to. It takes longer to prepare yourself for the workplace in the new information and services and technology economy. It takes longer for people to commit themselves to a love partner in marriage or other long-term relationship. People wait longer until they have their first child, and they have fewer of them than they used to. It takes longer for people to find a long-term job that's going to last for years and that they're going to build a career on. So in all these ways, 30 is the new 20. The entrance to adulthood comes later. I've spent the last 20 years interviewing young people from age 18 to 29 and trying to think of a way to conceptualize this as a developmental psychologist. Because traditionally in developmental psychology, we think about children, adolescence. After adolescence, you go to young adulthood, then middle adulthood, then late adulthood. Well, that doesn't make much sense, does it? To think of one life stage lasting from age 18 to age 40 or so. I don't know if it ever made much sense, but it sure doesn't today. These days that 30 is the new 20. What's going on in the 20s today for most young people in developed countries is much different than what was going on 50 years ago. 50 years ago, they really were making those adult transitions around age 20. Now that those transitions come at around age 30, what's happening in between is very different and much less settled, much more chaotic, and in many ways, at least for me as a psychologist, much more interesting. I also think that the sort of things that are going on developmentally in the 20s have implications for mental health and for how we understand the sorts of things that are going on in terms of mental health during the 20s. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm a developmental psychologist. I'm not a clinician. I'm not in mental health. But I think a lot of things that I've been studying over the last 20 years have implications for what you do in your work in mental health. Well, I'll let you be the judge of that, but I'll introduce you to some of these things today. I've proposed that there are 5 features that are distinctive to emerging adulthood. I'm going to talk about each of those. Distinctive, not unique. These are all things that I think start prior to emerging adulthood, and some of them are things that continue afterwards. But I think they're most prominent during this emerging adulthood life stage, lasting from roughly age 18 to 29. Those 5 features that I proposed are that it's the age of identity explorations, it's the age of instability, it's the self-focused age, it's the age of feeling in between, and it's the age of possibilities. Let me talk about each of those briefly in relation to mental health. I'm going to mention some data. It's all from a national survey that I conducted last year in the United States, the Clark University Poll of Emerging Adults. And I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that necessarily what I found in Americans will apply to you and the young people you know where you live. I'm just saying this is what I've found, and then you can tell me, and you can, if it applies where you are or not, and you can use it if you feel like it's useful to you. So first of all, it's the age of identity explorations. Now, traditionally in psychology, we think of identity as the prominent issue of adolescent development. That's how Erik Erikson proposed it. But that was proposed in 1950, and it's not 1950 anymore. Now a lot of things that Erikson talked about as happening during adolescence happen mainly during emerging adulthood instead. Emerging adulthood is when it's really crunch time for deciding what the form of your adult life is going to be. Erikson talked about love and work as the two main domains of identity exploration. And certainly in adolescence, people begin exploring possibilities in love and work, but they only become really serious about what form their adult lives are going to take in love and work, I think, in emerging adulthood. And in terms of mental health, deciding who you are is a big question. It can be an exciting question. In this Clark poll I mentioned, the national survey, 77% of Americans 18 to 29 agree that this is the time of my life for finding out who I really am. That can be fun, it can be exciting, it's dramatic, but it can also result in a lot of anxiety and sometimes depression. What if you can't answer that question about who you really are? What if you don't know? What if who you really think you are in love involves a person who doesn't feel the same way about you? You think you found your soulmate, but that person doesn't think that you are actually their soulmate. What if you have some ideal of work that you'd like to do and you feel like it's your true identity, it's what you really want to do, but for one reason or another that door is closed to you because you lack the economic resources to pursue it, or just because there's not room for as many people as want to do that particular profession? There are a lot of high-paying, high-status professions that a lot of people want to do, and there's not room for everyone to do them. So a lot of emerging adults find themselves trying to open a door that is not closed to them, and that's difficult. So identity explorations can be exciting, but they can also promote struggles in terms of mental health. It's the age of instability, and that's the same way. There's a lot of changes during the 20s. In the Clark poll, 77% of 18 to 29-year-olds agreed that this time of my life is full of changes. And it is full of changes, isn't it, the 20s? That's why it's so different than the way the 20s used to be. It's not a period for most people, at least the early part, is not a period of settling into adult life. It's a period of trying out a lot of different possibilities and changing the direction you go in. Young people make and break relationships during their 20s. They change their minds in terms of their educational directions. They change jobs very frequently, more frequently than in any other decade after that. In the US, the average number of job changes from age 20 to 29 is 7. So that's a lot of changes. And like the identity explorations that are related to these changes and all this instability, it can be exciting. It can be exciting not to know exactly what your life is going to look like a year from now, much less 5 years or 10 years or 20 years from now. But again, it can promote a lot of anxiety and depression. It can promote a sense that you're overwhelmed and that you don't know how to navigate your way toward a satisfying adult life. Number 3 is that it's the self-focused age. And I don't mean selfish. They're often accused of being selfish, but I don't think that's it. I think that's confusing what's going on developmentally with a personality trait. I think this is a time of life for focusing on yourself. And in that Clark poll, that item, this is a time of life for focusing on yourself. 71% of 18 to 29-year-olds agreed with that. So it's a time for focusing on yourself because you are constructing an adult life. You're working on constructing an adult life. You're trying to find a love partner. You're trying to prepare yourself for the adult workplace, and that means focusing on yourself. And that can be very exciting. It's exhilarating. Many of them find it exhilarating to be at this stage of life where they have control over their lives in a way they didn't before. Their parents don't have the same authority over them as they did when they were younger. They don't have to be in a school situation that doesn't appeal to them. They get to make their choices about that. So all these decisions that they get to make at this self-focused stage of life can be very exciting. But it can be lonely too. It can be lonely to have only yourself to rely on, even if it's also sometimes very satisfying, maybe even exhilarating. It can be lonely as well. And that too can provoke anxiety and depression. Number 4, it's the age of feeling in between. So the way I came up with the term emerging adulthood was that I started out 20 years ago with the simple question, do you feel like you've reached adulthood? I was curious what people would say. And I found, to my surprise, that most people didn't have a straight yes or no answer for that. They would most commonly say, well, in some ways I do, in some ways I don't. And they talk about the ways they did and did not feel like they'd reached adulthood. So that's why I've described it since as the age of feeling in between. They don't feel like adolescence anymore, and I think it's a mistake to call them adolescents, to call this late adolescence. They're different in adolescence in a lot of ways. They're not going through puberty, they're not minors under the law, and so on. But they don't feel entirely adult. That usually doesn't happen until in their late 20s, maybe their early 30s. And in terms of mental health, when you think about our mental health systems, we haven't, as I understand it, and you all are more experts than me, but my understanding is the health system generally has services for children, and then adolescents, and then adults. There's a system for adults, but it doesn't seem to matter whether the adult is 18 or 80. But this period of emerging adulthood from age 18 to 29 is different. The kinds of issues that they're dealing with are different than what's happening in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and so on. And so the fact that it does take this long period, the 20s is this period of feeling in between and not completely adult, is something that we need to recognize in order to address the kinds of mental health issues that are most important in their lives. And finally, it's the age of possibilities. And I think that has implications for mental health in a couple of ways. First of all, this is a really striking part of emerging adulthood to me, and it has been from the beginning, that they are so optimistic and so hopeful about the shape their adult lives will take. And that doesn't mean their lives are good now. Often they're not good now. Most of them are struggling in one way or another. Most of them are struggling with these identity questions. Most of them will feel lonely at least some of the time. They're trying to figure out what to do with their lives. So their current lives are often a struggle, but almost all of them feel that eventually life is going to smile on them. I've been struck by that from the beginning. So in this Clark poll, 83% of 18 to 29-year-olds agreed that at this time of my life, it still seems like anything is possible. 83%. And it's not 83% of them who otherwise feel good about their lives, quite the contrary. But they believe that brighter days are ahead. And in some ways that's worrisome. You know, I've interviewed emerging adults who are very optimistic about how their lives are going to turn out, but they're not really doing anything about it. They're really not making a plan with a capital P and following it in a systematic way. They're sort of expecting things to happen, accidents to happen, favorable accidents to happen that will give them the kind of adult lives they want. So in that way, it's a little bit worrisome. But I've also come to see it in many cases as a psychological resource. Because those years from 18 to 29, almost everybody gets knocked down. And most people get knocked down multiple times. You are in love with somebody who's not in love with you. You're in love with somebody who is in love with you, and then you break up for one reason or another. You move someplace hoping something good is going to happen for an educational purpose or an occupational purpose, and it doesn't work out the way you want it to. You get a job that you really like, and it seems really promising, and then you get fired because they tend to be the last to be hired and the first to be fired, or you just can't find a job. Consistently all over the developed world, the unemployment rate for young people is twice as high as the overall rate. And these days, of course, that's sometimes astronomically high. In Spain right now, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the overall employment rate is about 25%. It's 50% for young people in their 20s. And so that's got to be a frustrating state of things. But that optimism is what keeps them going in dire conditions, dire situations. It's what keeps them believing, it's what keeps them striving forward. And often they do find at least some semblance of the life they want. And finally, one other aspect of the age of possibilities is that there's big potential for change, I think, at age 18 to 29. Maybe more potential for change than in any other time of life. I've come to think of emerging adulthood as potentially a critical period for resilience. And that's simply because it's the time when people have the fewest ties, the least stability, the least of an entrenched life. If you think about children and adolescents that many of you work with, they're really often at the mercy of their families, aren't they? If you happen to be born into a nurturing, loving family that's promoting, your parents are devoted to your well-being, you have a stable household, that's great. But that's often not the case, especially with people who end up having mental health problems. If your parents are unkind to you, even abusive to you, if your parents have substance abuse problems, mental health problems, financial problems, marital problems, you're subject to it. You can't get away. But in emerging adulthood, that simple fact that you can get away, you can move out so that you're no longer subject to that environment on a daily basis, that can have remarkable effects. I've seen it in people I've interviewed, and I wonder if some of you have seen it as well. The fact that they are no longer going back to what is a potentially pathogenic environment every day can be crucially important in allowing them to turn their lives in another direction. So those are some ideas to consider in terms of how we might think developmentally about this period of life in relation to mental health. I would like to encourage all of you to consider joining the new Society for the Study of Emerging Adulthood. We have a big contingent of people in that group who are interested in mental health issues. And in our biennial conferences, we have a pre-conference day devoted to mental health issues. So I would be delighted to see a lot of you there. Next time, the place to check it all out is ssea.org, Society for the Study of Emerging Adulthood, ssea.org. Hope to see you there. Thank you.